Okay, now we're ready to talk about Visual Studio. So, building workflows for SharePoint 2013 with Visual Studio 2013. And the big change for the SharePoint 2013 platform, so Visual Studio 2012 also, is that the workflows are declarative only. So no custom code, no custom assemblies. But we're going to address that in a little bit, how you can get around that. You can have site collection deployment just like we were doing with SharePoint Designer. And there's no project templates. It's just item templates. So you create an empty SharePoint project and then you add the correct item templates to it for SharePoint. So you have a workflow item template and then a workflow custom activity. So you can create a custom activity in Visual Studio that can be consumed in SharePoint Designer. And then again, just like we saw in SharePoint Designer, there's the new HTTP send activity and then the dynamic value data type for handling the JSON requests and responses. So you might be thinking to yourself, why would I use one over the other? Why SharePoint Designer looks pretty nice and it does both of them are declarative, so what does it matter? Well, that's true. SharePoint Designer is a great experience and you can do rapid workflow development with both of them. You can create a reusable workflow in SharePoint Designer. You can also create one in Visual Studio, but the big change though is actually they're associated with the 0x1 content type. You're not allowed to choose what content type. So, and that goes the same for both. And can you include a workflow as part of a SharePoint solution or app for SharePoint? Well, no, because you can't create SharePoint apps in SharePoint Designer. Visual Studio, yes. Can't create custom actions in SharePoint Designer. You can in Visual Studio. And custom code, no in both. There is no more custom code. Can you use Visual Professional? Yeah, you can use Visual with SharePoint Designer, but not Visual Studio. And deployment, yeah, it's automatic with SharePoint Designer, but you could actually save your workflow as a template, which will create a WSP, and then you could use that from Visual Studio or just deploy the WSP that way. Both have one-click publishing. You can package and deploy to a remote server. Now here's a big item. SharePoint Designer does not have debugging. Visual Studio does. We'll take a look at that. So, you get the full locals, watch window, all that good stuff. You can set a breakpoint in your workflow. Even though it's declarative, you can still set a breakpoint. And of course, they both allow the site administrator to approve actions. So what we're going to do right now is we'll use Visual Studio to create a 2013 workflow. I have a 2010 code-based workflow, and I want to show how do you migrate that. So I'm going to start out with the SharePoint 2010 workflow first. Okay, we are in Visual Studio now, and I have a solution and actually some projects for Chapter 16 for our workflows. And so the first one I have is a 2010 workflow. And so just so you can see how that works, if I say add new project, I can do well, actually it's not, I take that back. I can add a new item to a project. So this is an empty SharePoint project. If I add new item, I have a choice. So the little blue S here, that means SharePoint 2013. So that's workflow and then workflow custom activity. But then here's the sequential workflow, and that says farm solution only. State machine workflow, farm solution only. Those are for 2010. Those are both for 2010. So I have a sequential workflow here for SharePoint 2010. So here's the same. It's exactly the way it was in SharePoint 2010. Even Visual Studio 2010 and 2012. It looks identical because Microsoft didn't do any improvement to it. They just left it the way it was for backwards compatibility. So all we have here is a sequential workflow with a code activity, but this actually means that there's a solution package and there's a custom assembly in there. So if I go to the manifest, you'll see here's our assembly, our chapter 16.2010 workflow.dll. So that has to be deployed on the server as a farm solution. And let's view the code. Oops. Wrong one. There we go. Okay, so you can see, pretty simple. I just have this, if I go back here and I double click on my code activity, it's going to take me here to code activity 1 underscore execute code. And so I have some code here where I'm getting the current list item. So this is a list workflow. And it's actually, let me open up the SharePoint site. So there's a product inventory list, and let's just modify this for a second here. Let's do a quick edit on this. Let's just get these values out of here. I guess we can leave that. That's fine. We'll just leave it the way it is. Anyway, so we have our product inventory list. There's product name, state, and then the price before tax, price after tax, MSRP, manufacturer suggested retail price, and price after tax. So if we go to the code, you can see we're getting the price before tax on the current item. We're getting the state, and then I have a method here that says calculate tax by state. And I have some logic here to figure out what state you're in, and I just hard coded it, just random numbers here. But think of, maybe this would be some type of, big, large, complicated piece of code here, or maybe several classes put together, whatever. But this goes ahead and returns the price after tax. So it calculates the tax and then adds that on. And so then we update the item with the price after tax and call update on the item. So, but we can't do code in Visual Studio 2013. So first thing I'm going to do is I'll just go ahead and deploy this. And we'll just take a look at it just to make sure it works. Actually, I want to change that. I don't want that to be, I want that to be 0.086, and this should be 0.0775. So let's just redeploy that again as soon as it's ready. There we go. And it should automatically activate the feature. Okay. And let's just go ahead and run that just so you can see. So if I go to browse, let's just close that, open it up again. Oh, we have to wait because we deployed this. So another disadvantage of we had to actually deploy the solution to the server, and so it has to reset IS. So IS had to restart, so I have to wait for that delay. So now click on the list. Now our workflow should be there for 2010. And it's here. So we'll just run that. Should calculate the tax and the price on the first item. And sure enough, it did it right away. It did it all in line, so that's why it brought us right back here. You can see the price after tax. It's completed. Everything's good to go. So that all happened right on the server. The 2010 workflow, it's all executed. It's a timer job, so that timer job ran immediately. So now let's go back and look at our 2013 workflow. How are we going to do the custom code? How's that going to work? Well, what I've done is I've actually created a web service, and this is a ASP.NET project in Visual Studio 2013, and I'm using the web API. So you can see I have an inventory controller. It's really simple, but I have this HTTP GET in front of it, so that's how this is getting exposed as a REST web service, as a REST endpoint. And you can see that exact same calculation that was done before is now put into a web service. And so we can we'll set that to be the startup project. We'll just run that so we can actually see what the API call looks like. MVC web API scaffolding here to take a look at our web API implementation. It's a little bit slow. It's the first time it's running, so it's just a little bit slow. It's got to start up the web server using IIS Express. Okay, here we go. Now we're going to go to our API. And here is our inventory resource, and you can see all we do is return a double. So it's really simple. We're not even returning JSON, it's just a double. So JSON is just it's just text. That's all we're returning right here. For JSON, there's no arrays or anything like that. It's just since it's just returning a simple number, it's just really compact. So that should be really fast. I'll go ahead and close that. And now you see what's happening there. So now let's go into the chapter 13 workflow. I've created this project. I'm not going to recreate this, but I am going to open up my I'll open up the workflow. Everything is identical pretty much, but it looks a little bit different. So what I need to do, the first thing that happens here is I have to use the lookup SP list item action. So let's look at the let's get the toolbox going here. Here we go. So for list, I have lookup SP list item right here. And lookup SP list item returns the properties of the specified list item as a dynamic value. So when I put this on here and I click get properties, it automatically creates that. So I don't want to delete that. But if I go to view the properties, you can see here, similar to SharePoint Designer, it's the entity type is it's a list item of product inventory, and then the path is just the field name, so MSRP and state, and then I have variables, just like in the SharePoint workflow. So the way you look at the variables is come up to the very top, and these are the variables that I've defined. So here's my price before tax, which is double, and then state, which is a string, obviously. So that's what we're getting out of the this dynamic value or dictionary when we look up the list item. And so the source, so the dictionary name or the dynamic value is actually called field value. So that's a dynamic value. So the next thing we need to do then is I think I have this duplicated here, don't I? Let's see if this is okay. Yeah, so let's delete. I have had that in there too many times. I'll save that. Let's go back to see our variables. Okay, so then what I'm going to do is write to the history. I hit F4, I can go to the properties, and here I build the messages a little bit different. It's actually using C# code. So my variable is state. So state, standard string building here for C#. So state plus, a string here, empty space, and then price before tax dot toString because it's a double. SharePoint Designer takes care of that for us, but we have to do that here in Visual Studio. It's more granular. So then the HTTP send function is here. So this is where we're doing a GET request. And the URI, that's our endpoint. So we're calling, let's make this bigger. Whoops. So you can see we're calling the web service that we just looked at. And I'm using the string.format function. So I know I have to substitute in the price input and the state. So I'm using my variables, my price before tax and state. So that's the URL that we're building. Response content it's just returning flat text. So I can actually assign that directly to my price after tax variable. And so that's all I'm doing. I don't have to do parsing on that. And then I'll go ahead and just capturing the status code here of the HTTP call. And then once I do that, then I'm updating the list item. So if I go the properties of this, I have to specify I want the current item ID, current list ID. Oh, and that reminds me, I need to show this as well. So current item ID, current list ID, and then the result it goes to field values. And then this one is an update list item action. So the list item properties dynamic value. So it's a dynamic value that is accepting. So we click on the ellipse to build that, and so I know that the it's using the static column name. So I created the column with spaces in it, but I know internally the way that's stored for that column is it's the underscore x0020 underscore for the spaces. That's how they're escaped in XML, or that's how SharePoint names the columns when you put spaces in it, when you create it from the UI. So we're just setting the price after tax field to the price after tax workflow variable. And I'll just go ahead and deploy this. And that's going to activate the feature. So that will associate it with the list as well. And I already have that list there, so I'll just resolve that, the workflow task list. Okay, so that's succeeded. Now what I want to do is I'm going to hit F5 to run this, and I want to set a breakpoint here. So I'll insert breakpoint. Actually, that's not where I want the breakpoint. I want the breakpoint right here, and you'll see why in a second. So we'll go ahead and we'll set this as the startup project, and we'll run it. So it's going to deploy again, and then it'll start up the site, and it's going to attach the debugger. So that's nice. We don't get that experience in SharePoint Designer. So the debugger is getting attached. And that's an external process, so it's going to ask me to attach to that process. So yep, I want to attach to that. So you can see the process it's attaching to. So I'll attach to that. Okay, now let's go to product inventory, and we'll do second item, calculate the price after tax, and we'll run this. It hasn't hit yet because it hasn't been we initiated. So now there it hit. So we're debugging right now. So this is nice. We don't get this in SharePoint Designer. So I can see, here's the results I got back. Here's the JSON I got back from, or this is the results from reading the current item. So since it's on a different server, it's making that web service call into SharePoint to get the data. So that's what it looks like. And you can see the let's see here, price before tax is $4.99. The state is Washington. Price after tax is null because we didn't calculate it yet. So let's go ahead and F10. Continue. And now we're getting ready to send it. Let's just continue. Let's just let it run through. Actually, we'll let it stop here. We'll F10 to here. And now you can see, I'll wait for this to return. So it's calling the web service right now. Hopefully IS Express is still running, so that web service endpoint will still be alive. We'll see. We may get an error if it's not, but we're debugging, so it should tell us. We'll know here in a minute. So far, so good. We're not seeing any errors here. Let's see. I guess it didn't break. Okay. Maybe I just need to set a breakpoint there. That's okay. We'll just let it go. So let's go back to the site. Close. Oh, okay. I just closed that down, so I'm not even sure if it finished running yet. It probably did. So let me just refresh this. Yes, it did. It ran. Okay. And so, yep, that's perfect. So it ran our set pricing level demo. Yep. Okay, perfect. So that worked. And also, just as for the heck of it, so you can see, so the big takeaway here is that we were able to, let me get rid of that breakpoint. We were able to make a nice declarative workflow that had custom logic, and the technique was just to move that custom logic out into a web service. And so that web service could be running anywhere, right? It could be running on your premises, on Azure, who cares? As long as it's publicly reachable, or reachable, not publicly, but reachable from whatever server the workflow manager is running on. And so I was able to contact it, was able to run that, get that value. Now, as a little comparison, I just want to show you that exact same workflow done in SharePoint Designer 2013, just for the heck of it, just so you can compare. And it's nice. It's very nice. Here it is right here. Very simple. I'll wait for it to come up. It's pretty simple and compact. Very easy to read. The only thing is we can't debug here. So that's the downside. But you know, we can still write to the history log. So anyway, this looks pretty easy. So here we're just same thing. We're doing the call. Here's the call to the web service. It's a little bit different. So the response. So let's look at the variables. The response is a dictionary, and what I'm doing is I'm actually just I set the variable price after tax to that, so I have to cast that as a string. So no matter what, SharePoint Designer treats the response that you get from the web service call, even if it doesn't return complex data, it treats it as a dictionary. So I have to cast it to my scalar value here, the price after tax. So anyway, that's a nice comparison. We saw the SharePoint 2010 workflow that had code in it. We had to deploy a custom assembly to the farm, to the actual servers. We had to touch the servers with SharePoint, with Visio Studio and SharePoint Designer. We were able to create declarative workflows, and we brought the logic out that required code into a web service, and we called that from our workflow. And we were able to do it all declaratively, which means we could either put it in a SharePoint app or a sandbox solution, since we're just deploying declarative code. And we don't need to touch the servers. We can just upload that to the site collection solutions gallery. So it's a really nice model. I really, really like the new workflow manager. That's the new workflow platform for SharePoint 2013.